The lies I referred to are a set of ideas that are promulgated concerning the evolved nature of our society, in which contemporary individual and personal life is cut off from the dreadful collective past that has produced it in the first instance, and we must therefore not reference that past as still animating our collective present. Some scholars have called this white innocence, but I prefer to call it lies. Lies for me mean that the force of these ideas is such that one cannot escape them. One must go through them to potentially arrive at a different place. But I also call them lies because even our more important ideas for producing a different kind of world finds those ideas having to somehow be compromised in the context of the routinized and enforced idea that the terrible past is behind us now. More importantly, whiteness is also a structure. And by this, I mean a set of logics, ideas, practices that work to reproduce white people as superior to others, and therefore as benefiting from a society built to confer and confirm that superiority. Secondly, by whiteness, I mean to signal a structure of feeling in which those marked as white share in and benefit from the conditions that produce societal advantages for white people. Additionally, those not marked as white are positioned as aspirants to it. Those aspirants I call, following Frank B. Wilderson III, junior partners in white supremacy and white superiority. The important thing to note is that whiteness as a structure keeps in place a post-Columbus global compact in which not white people are generally and ideologically positioned as less than in a crude and rank order of beings. In the execution and maintenance of this Eurocentrism, we are asked to accept the lie that European Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment understandings and interpretations of and impositions of a particular way of experiencing the world and living it is the only way to do so. Resistance by indigenous people, black peoples, and other not white and some white ethnic minorities have often forced Canada to revise its Eurocentrism. But the nation state has never fully abandoned it. It is the revisions, often felt to be progressive, as ushering in change, that become the platform for other kinds of lies that keeps the Eurocentric white supremacy firmly in place in Canada. But instead, the long discredited language of unconscious bias and its claims has been returned to us as the way forward in a range of governing institutions. In particular at my university, unconscious bias is the rage. What the language of unconscious bias does is that it refuses to acknowledge how the structure of institutions reproduce particular practices and ways of being. And furthermore, it seeks to not place any one particular person as responsible for the perpetuation of those practices of advantage making. The French philosopher Etienne Balibar wrote of racism without race. Unconscious bias does not make a similar move. It attends to practices and behaviors without attending to institutional arrangements. In this instance, it is more like racism without racists. This slip is crucial for maintaining the white supremacist arrangement of our institutions without having to account for how they're enforced, their reproduction, and how those inside of them are responsible and benefit from that reproduction. Indeed, in an effort to not offend white people, we have gone so far to talk about racism as structural to the extent that people go missing from the structures. So to be clear, white people are the face of white supremacy and they benefit from it. We cannot avoid making that claim simply clear. Indigenizing and decolonizing is being harnessed and redeployed to preserve the structure of whiteness with a few adjustments and revisions. Indeed, if radical thinkers found multiculturalism in its logic of diversity wanting, diversity too has returned as the most robust term now used to winnow out the radical politics and potentialities of indigenizing and decolonizing. Calls for diversity dressed up in indigenizing and colonizing rhetoric fail to adequately account for whiteness as a structuring device of our institutional and everyday lives. The hard truth of the matter is that the governing and administrative apparatus of whiteness is prepared to appropriate any discourse, any politics, any ideas, and any ideals that retained the post-Columbus Compact, a compact where Europe and its derivative nations and their peoples, now marked as white, continue to be given privileged status across the globe. The advantage of whiteness then cannot be divorced from the logics of white supremacy and white superiority. The idea of white privilege is but one component of white superiority and white supremacist logics, and their institutionalization of whiteness as the standard to be attained. The paradox that we find ourselves in is one in which, to descend to whiteness and produce a different kind of world, we find ourselves working to pacify whiteness so that other potentialities might emerge. It is the totality of white hegemony that the transformative logics of decolonization are meant to disrupt, break, and produce something new. So to draw heavily on the work of, and I won't bore you with lots of quotes from them, but this is who's influencing what I'm thinking here right now. To draw heavily on the work of Adolph Reed Jr., Lyndon Barrett, and Cyril R. James, we can make sense of how the potential libertarian moments of the 1960s have been interrupted by a retrenchment of whiteness. Using their work, I mark the mid-60s as a time when the potential overthrow of whiteness seemed possible. The social movements of the 60s, in their short-sightedness, I think, failed to rethink value as foundational to post-Columbus orders of life. And so those social movements were easily incorporated into the existing logics and structures of white supremacist patriarchal capitalism, to use the language of bell hooks. Cyril R. James in 1939, anticipating such a moment, articulated what he called a Negro movement that would participate in the larger possible anti-capitalist revolution, but with its own and probably very different outcomes. James made his comments in relation to the Communist Party's failure to both recruit and to adequately address Negro American problems. James was in part offering a critique of whiteness and its structural logics. His analysis pointed to the ways in which various black movements had embedded in them the ability to sacrifice for what he called the promise of a new society. What are the ways in which our current apparatus for transformation might work to produce white self-sacrifice for the promise of a new society? The truth is that white people clinging to whiteness and its ideological apparatus is as bad for them as it is for the rest of us. Their inability to betray whiteness as a structure of knowing, as a regimen of encountering the world, as a measure of what it means to be human, and as an arrangement for the terms in and on which we govern our collective selves, remains a danger for all of us. Indeed, I'm interested in witnessing in my lifetime white people and whiteness abdicating its lofty place atop the human scale. That is, the disappearance of the scale altogether. We ignore the scale's existence to our own collective peril. The current articulation of anti-white racism is a blunt refusal of the potential to transform. And yet the politics of transformation has consistently been built on both the possibility and the desired reality that white people and whiteness can transform. In fact, many of our political compromises for a different world have been premised on such assumptions. White people will have to risk something here. They will have to risk that we won't do to them what they have done to us and continue to do to us. The measure of a possible future begins at the moment of the betrayal of whiteness, both in its bodily comportment and in its authority to know, narrate, administer, and thus command the terms of social relations and sociality. Radical politics has never been conceived with a notion that white people are incapable of transformation, as I said before. It has always understood its desires for another world as a collective endeavor. And in so doing, that has meant that the kind of radical politics I'm imagining here has a central role for people now marked as white to play. A pure decolonial project seriously requires us to consciously push collectively into the not yet known, because the now known is so deeply unsatisfactory.